Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Michael and Fraser. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to build on the two excellent presentations from Mike and Fraser, but delve a little bit more deeply into efforts in Scotland to manage and own land for public good and strengthen and secure community land rights. And this is an area where Scotland is both leading and also lagging behind, which I think puts us in a good place in terms of the discussion of the next couple of days. So I'm going to be making this presentation on behalf, in my role as a Director of Community Land Scotland, but also drawing on practical experience working on land reform here in Scotland and internationally for the last 25 years. I'm also currently employed as a community landowner in Applecross in the North West Highlands, so I'm going to be bringing some of that lived experience into the presentation. So after Mike and Fraser, I don't really need to say a lot more about the model of community land ownership, but I do want to emphasise the importance of the fact that this land governance model by law must both be democratically accountable to the local community and ensure that the land is governed in the public interest. The regulations governing community land ownership have evolved over time, and this has seen the geographical spread of community land ownership go from rural into now urban areas across Scotland, and also has seen a change of some of the priorities around the acquisition of land, so that we're moving away from acquisitions in many ways focused on restorative justice to acquisitions in order to deliver community objectives from a development perspective. It was really interesting to hear from Fraser about how that journey compares to other countries, and there's a few additional observations I wanted to make. Although Scotland has a history of land governance for the common good, for example, the crofting and common grazing systems and common good land, the community right to buy is in fact a modern right, and this sets it apart from the rights to land and natural resources of Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples and local communities in many parts of the world, where that right to land is a historical continuation of land governance and based on traditional ancestral rights. Another key difference is the political economy context of Scotland's community right to buy. Not only are these rights enshrined in law and they are secure, but they're upheld by policy frameworks and financial support, and also are part of the government's own performance framework. And this could not be further from the situation facing Indigenous communities that I used to live with, for example, in Southeast Asia, whose rights are not recognised in laws and whose ancestral lands is continually being grabbed by companies and corrupt government officials, for example, for rubber soil and soya plantations. And a third and more subtle difference is the connection in Scotland between community ownership and community empowerment. Because of that core requirement of the model, that the land is managed in a democratically accountable way and is delivering public good, the community ownership as a model has become the vehicle for delivering wider community development in these areas. And I think that's something really important that Scotland should speak more about, and is relevant for other parts of the world, particularly in the Global South, where community development is very much led by NGOs and third sector groups, and communities are often just seen as passive recipients of that. Why is community ownership necessary in Scotland? In many ways, it's a direct response to Scotland's concentrated pattern of land ownership. Thanks to the research of Andy and others, we know that currently 421 landowners own 50% of Scotland's privately owned rural land, or put it another way, nearly 70% of Scotland's private rural land is owned by 0.02% of the population. And what's more, inequality is increasing. Over half of land holdings that were sold over 500 hectares in size, sold between 2020 and 2023, were acquired by those already owning land in Scotland. Now, those of us working in land reform often recite these statistics, but I wanted just to take a minute to talk about what it actually really means to live in a situation of concentrated land ownership, because that's where I live in Applecross. So Applecross is a peninsula in the North West Highlands. It's on the mainland, but it's tucked in behind Skye and Raasay. The peninsula is 26,000 hectares of land. Over 95% of that land belongs to one entity. And they have a hugely significant degree of power and control over land, ownership, management, use and access, with wide-ranging social, economic and environmental impacts. So therefore, the availability of land for housing, for expanding local businesses, for crofting, environmental protection, access, and everything depends on this very small group, which gives them absolute control and retains that control in the hands of a very small number of people, none of which live nearby. So everyone living and working on the peninsula is very aware that disagreeing with the owner or speaking out about them may result in negative impacts in terms of losing jobs, homes, or livelihoods. In this context, what can a community do to respond to local needs? It took my employer, for example, the Local Development Trust, a decade of negotiations with the landowner to acquire simply 2 hectares in order to respond to an affordable housing crisis. And Applecross is not unique. The Land Commission published research by SRUC in 2019 about the range of negative impacts as a result of concentrated ownership and control over land across the country. And although the degree of concentration of land ownership in Scotland is unusual internationally, that trend of increasing concentration is not. A report was published in 2020 by the International Land Coalition and Oxfam called Uneven Ground, which highlighted this trend globally and the concerning negative impacts that land inequality was having on wider social inequalities and inclusive sustainable development. The drivers this report identified included industrial agriculture and corporate capture of land, the financialisation of land investments, as well as weak regulatory mechanisms and institutions. So how does Scotland fit into that analysis? There's going to be a session already, as we've heard from Ian this afternoon, on rural land markets, which is going to delve into this a bit more detail. But the increasing in concentration of land ownership in Scotland is directly related to the increasing pressure on land and the changing land markets, because this demand is transforming how land is valued and who gets to control it, which is putting significant pressure on existing land governance systems. Key drivers behind this in turn include investments in natural capital, industrial forestry, and also demand for land for explicitly biodiversity and nature regeneration acquisitions. And we see a number of different actors involved. We have companies trying to offsetting their own carbon emissions through land acquisitions. We've got financial sector investors, and we've also got significant role being played by NGOs and other private landowners. So I used to lead an international campaign against land grabbing in a previous job. So I try and keep track of where the global discussions are around land grabbing. And there was a whole issue in the Journal of Peasant Studies published this summer, which focused on the current status of land grabbing and highlights the results of the 2024 conference of the Land Deal Politics Initiative. And this edition concludes that land grabbing has evolved from the initial rush for agricultural and farmland investments into having currently 3 interlinked drivers: climate policies, the financialisation of land investments, and transnational deals. And this is creating an outcome of a relentless push for land grabbing at multiple scales through diverse mechanisms, which are mapping a path towards commodification, concentration, and dispossession. And although we don't normally consider Scotland to be a country currently impacted by land grabbing, we are already experiencing land commodification and concentration. And when we look at the impact of those rapidly increasing land values I mentioned, we see communities being priced out of the market, as Mike's already said. There have been a number of high-profile community attempts to purchase land and assets in recent years, which have failed as they were unable to raise the funds required despite having government support. And I would argue that the dispossession of the rights to access the community right to buy is a really significant issue for the future question of land reform in Scotland, and it's going to have long-term detrimental impacts. We know from the successes of community ownership that taking control of land and buildings enables the community to start to deliver a huge range of benefits, providing affordable homes, creating jobs, essential enterprise, economic regeneration, environmental protection, as well as protecting Gaelic cultural heritage. So not only do these things have a direct local impact, positive local impact, they also help to meet government targets. So we really need to ensure that the community right to buy is not further undermined by these land market trends. But what other international lessons might Scotland be able to learn about how to progress community land rights? An enabling framework used around the world to progress land reform of human rights, particularly the rights directly related to land, what are known as the economic, social and cultural rights. And here again, Scotland is an outlier. As part of the UK, Scotland is a signatory to the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. However, because these rights are not included in the European Convention on Human Rights, which is what Scotland's legal framework is aligned to, they're not in practice given equal weight in law. And as a result, certain rights within the European Convention, such as the right to property, have been used over many years to hinder the progressive realisation of the economic, social and cultural rights, and thus hinder the progress of land reform. And although some small steps have been made to embed references to economic, social and cultural rights into the previous Land Reform Acts, and the Scottish Government has also made a commitment to incorporate these rights into the national legal framework, we're not actually seeing significant progress on the ground at the moment, moving beyond that high-level rhetoric. And this is the point I want to return to in terms of that third key conclusion from the Oxfam and International Land Coalition report, that tackling rising land inequality and concentration requires strong legislation and government commitment. Because for me, at this stage in Scotland's land reform journey, this is one of the most important lessons Scotland needs to learn from the global land reform context, that our overall ambition for a fair, just and sustainable future, a just transition in land, requires us to stem that tide of increasing concentration of land ownership, and that requires bold and ambitious land reform that's embedded in statute and in institutions. Last Wednesday, the Parliament passed the latest land reform bill. There's some very good elements in that bill. For the first time, the state can proactively intervene in land sales to break up land holdings if it's deemed to be in the public interest. However, the bill does not go in any way far enough to meaningfully enable us to intervene into the land market or change the fundamental inequalities of land ownership in Scotland, nor does it match the wider appetite and public ambition for land reform. So the question is, where does Scotland's land reform journey go now? Can we wait for these more incremental changes, or is something more radical needed? Hopefully the Commission's Scotland Futures exercise is going to help give us some clear direction, but I think we need more than that. Because at the end of the day, land reform matters not in terms of the legal detail, but because land is about home, it's about food, it's about culture and connectivity, both to our past as well as to our future. And this connection is always going to be emotional rather than it is technical. And I think we need to find a way to tap into that emotional connection with land reform in order to be able to progress it forward at that level of statute and the institutional and government commitment. So, thank you very much.